Welcome, deep divers. Today, we're diving headfirst into something that feels, well, both really personal and incredibly widespread. It's something I bet a lot of you listening have bumped into, maybe even just scrolling through social media. Picture this. You're on X, just catching up, and a friend's post pops up. It's vulnerable, maybe a bit raw, and they're talking about deconstructing their faith. Maybe they're sharing some really deep doubts they've been wrestling with, or maybe disillusionment with how they grew up, their religious background, sometimes even announcing they're stepping away from the church they used to call home. And seeing that, well, it can hit hard, can it? You might feel this mix of concern, maybe a little bit of heartbreak, or honestly just confusion. Like, why? Why is this happening? And why does it feel like it's happening so much right now here in 2025? I mean, you see headlines about scandals, right? And the online debates just seem endless. They can really fuel doubts. Plus, society itself is shifting in ways that challenge beliefs people have held for a long, long time. It's definitely become part of our, collective spiritual landscape. So this brings us to a really big question, a crucial question for all of us, and maybe for you personally listening right now. Is all this questioning, is it the beginning of the end for a lot of people's faith, a sign of decline? Or could it actually be something else? Maybe a challenging path, yeah, maybe even painful sometimes, but ultimately necessary, a path towards something richer, maybe deeper roots, a more authentic connection to what really matters. That's what we want to explore today. That's our mission for this deep dive, to look at this complex, sometimes really turbulent journey with thoughtfulness, with compassion, and hopefully with some genuinely helpful insights drawn right from our sources.
It is a vital question. And I think a lot hinges on how we actually define what's going on here. Because what's fascinating is how often we toss around terms like deconstruction without maybe having a clear shared understanding of what we mean. From a, well, more scholarly angle, deconstruction is often seen as this deliberate, systematic process. You're rethinking your whole belief system, kind of taking it apart piece by piece to examine it.
Okay, like a careful look.
Exactly, a thorough re-examination of faith. You have writers like Elisa Childers and Tim Barnett who describe it as a postmodern process of reevaluating faith. And sometimes this happens without Scripture being the sole ultimate standard people are using. Mark Hackett talks about it as an active, deliberate dismantling. And it can involve looking really closely at everything from core doctrines all the way to, say, hypocrisy within religious communities. David Morris, from Leaked Drive Books, really emphasizes that point, that it's about analyzing and sometimes refusing to participate in systems that just don't align with your conscience anymore.
Right.
So essentially it's about dismantling beliefs, that's a phrase Christianity today uses, or fundamentally rethinking faith, as Angela J. Harrington puts it.
I really connect with that image, the deliberate dismantling part. It makes me think of, okay, this might sound a bit silly, but like remodeling your faith house. It's messy, right? Absolutely messy. You're tearing down walls, pulling up floorboards. You're probably living in a construction zone for a while. But the hope, the reason you do it, is to rebuild something stronger in the end. Something more aligned with who you are now, maybe with a deeper grasp of truth. It feels active, deliberate, not just watching things crumble.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And that rebuilding piece is where the second step, the really vital step, comes in. It's what we're calling deepening or reconstruction. And this is where the narrative often shifts because, like you said, many people aren't actually looking to just abandon faith completely. They're searching for a way to rebuild their beliefs, but on a foundation they feel is stable, maybe truer. The goal really becomes a faith that's deeper, more resilient, more authentic. Ian Harber, who's joining us later, talks about this so powerfully in his book, Walking Through Deconstruction. It's a sentiment echoed by reviewers like Bob on Books, and it speaks to this idea of an evolving faith, something authors like Sarah Bessey have explored. The aim isn't destruction, it's transformation. Ian Harber, drawing from his own journey and observations, makes it really clear, and this point is also highlighted by Christianity Today, that many people who start deconstructing are, quote, by and large, looking for a way to stay in faith, not leave it. They're hunting for integrity, for authenticity.
And helping us navigate this really personal, often bumpy terrain today is someone who hasn't just studied it, but has genuinely lived it. We're so glad to have Ian Harber with us. He's the author of Walking Through Deconstruction, How to Be a Companion in a Crisis of Faith. And he comes to us, in his own words, as a deconstruction survivor, someone who went through a period of really intense questioning, but found his way to what he calls a settled trust in the Lord. His journey, I think, offers such a powerful, tangible example of what might be possible on the other side of profound doubt. So throughout this deep dive, we're going to really dig into why. Why are so many people questioning their faith right now? And how can we navigate this process, either for ourselves or alongside others, with grace and wisdom? And ultimately, what does it really mean to cultivate that deeper, more authentic faith journey, one that can actually withstand the tests of time and doubt? So, if you're listening out there and maybe you're wrestling with some tough questions yourself, or perhaps you're supporting a loved one who is, or maybe you're just curious about this whole trend, please know this. Your courage to ask hard questions, that's commendable. You are definitely not alone in this, and there is genuine hope for a path forward. We hope this conversation offers you some insight, some empathy, and maybe even a renewed sense of purpose on your own journey.
And if you are feeling that weight of questioning, just know that God is with you, even in the uncertainty. May you find some clarity and maybe some peace as you explore these ideas with us today.
Amen to that. Okay, let's dive in then. Let's try to unpack this. What is genuinely driving so many people right now to re-examine their spiritual foundations? It really does feel like the ground beneath our collective feet is shifting, and for a lot of folks, that includes their faith tradition.
You're absolutely right. The ground is shifting, and our sources, well, they point to several really potent forces at play, but maybe the most significant and often the primary driver, as Mark Hackett explains it, is something we often call church hurt, or even trauma. And we're not talking about minor discomfort here. This is often a deep, lasting pain. It can leave significant emotional and spiritual scars.
Right. Not just disagreeing with a sermon.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Think about the kinds of examples our research brings up. Things like abusive leadership, the shockwaves from scandals that just erode trust completely, pervasive hypocrisy within Christian communities. Tim Keller talks about this quite a bit. These aren't just isolated incidents for many. They feel like a breakdown of integrity at a core level. Then there's that insidious us versus them mentality you see sometimes. Often it gets tangled up with nationalism or certain fundamentalist ideologies that, as Mark Hackett points out, can feel completely contrary to the actual essence of the gospel. Yet they're widespread in many American evangelical contexts. And beyond those systemic issues, some individuals have tragically experienced direct sexual or spiritual abuse within the church itself. And that, as sources like Childers and Barnett and Christianity Today emphasize, is profoundly traumatic. It leaves incredibly deep wounds.
Wow, that's heavy.
It is. And our guest, Ian Harber, speaks to this so profoundly from his own life. He talks about experiencing grief, loss, and abuse. And then, tragically, when he actually dared to raise genuine questions about his faith, looking for answers, Christianity Today notes that members of his church responded with hostility and betrayal.
Oh, man. Instead of support, hostility.
Exactly. Ian's story perfectly illustrates how church hurt isn't just about, say, doctrinal disagreements. It's about deep relational pain, betrayal. And he explains further, as we mentioned, that for many, their initial questioning isn't about leaving. He says, by and large, they are looking for a way to stay. They want integrity, a healthier way to express faith, not necessarily to abandon it altogether. We also see this reflected in issues like how women are treated, their role in ministry. These are questions Ian's friend Jenny raised in his book, also highlighted by Christianity Today. It all points towards what writers like Angela J. Harrington and, again, Childers and Barnett often call toxic religious culture or even toxic theology. It's this deep, sometimes systemic wounding that just chips away at trust.
That paints a really sobering picture, and it really highlights how deeply our experiences within a community, shape our faith. I just imagine for many, experiencing betrayals like that, it must leave such a deep scar. How does someone even begin to trust again after that? It's clearly not just about intellectual disagreement at that point.
That's such a vital question. Both Mark Hackett and Angela Harrington stress that acknowledging the trauma itself is absolutely key. It's not just, oh, I disagree with this doctrine. It's recognizing these deep emotional wounds. And actually, that leads us right into the second major category of why people are questioning intellectual doubts. A critical re-examination of beliefs that maybe for a long time were considered unquestioned, as Tim Keller puts it. A huge area here, unsurprisingly, is the Bible itself, its reliability, its inerrancy. People are asking really fundamental questions about its authority, its trustworthiness.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
Right. Ian Harber's friend Jenny, for instance, she questioned the Bible's authority right alongside issues like the church's treatment of women. And the debates around biblical literalism versus, say, inerrancy are, well, they're fierce and well documented in Christian thought today. You've got thinkers like Peter Enns, his books, The Bible Tells Me So and The Sin of Certainty are pretty influential. Christian Smith's The Bible Made Impossible also challenges some traditional, more rigid interpretations. Robert D. Cornwall touches on these too in his review of God After Deconstruction. Then you have the work of someone like Bart Ehrman, books like Misquoting Jesus or Forged. He delves into how biblical texts were transmitted over time, how they were sometimes altered, maybe intentionally, maybe just accidentally, and how that impacts our understanding of doctrine. Scholars like Jacob L. Wright, in Why the Bible Began, present the Bible more as a collection of diverse writings, something that evolved over centuries and isn't always entirely self-consistent. That can be really jarring if you were taught a more monolithic, perfectly harmonized view.
And then someone like John H. Walton, with his Lost World series, explores the ancient Near Eastern context for Genesis and human origins. He suggests that maybe science and the Bible aren't inherently at odds, but our interpretations might be the source of tension. He offers a way to kind of bridge those perceived gaps.
So it's a lot of wrestling with the text itself, how it came to be, what it actually says, versus what we've been told it says.
Exactly. Consider the journey of Marlon Villas. He's a retired minister who wrote about his own deconstruction in Reform Journal. His process started way back in college. His zoology professor talked about evolution, about an Earth billions of years old.
Which would directly contradict a literal 6-day creation story.
Precisely. And that contradiction sparked something. He started reevaluating foundational stories he grew up with, like the 6-day creation, Noah's Ark, beginning to see them perhaps as just a story, powerful stories, but maybe not literal history in the modern sense. He grappled with really difficult Old Testament passages, like in Joshua, where God seems to sanction genocide. He wrestled with what that implied about God's character. He questioned the virgin birth narrative, wondering if it was a later addition, maybe with Greek influences. He even debated the idea of the cross as a blood sacrifice, feeling it was sort of foreign to the Hebrew mindset. These weren't minor quibbles for him. They were fundamental challenges that demanded he reevaluate everything.
Wow. That takes courage.
It really does. And that perceived conflict between science and faith, like Villas experienced, is another huge factor igniting these intellectual doubts. Being told the Earth was billions of years old and animals developed over millions of years directly challenged his early religious teaching and kicked off his deconstruction. Beyond that, even the very nature of God is being re-examined. Traditional views of an all-powerful, unchanging God are being questioned. This leads some to explore concepts of a God who is maybe more loving in a relational sense, even passable, meaning a God who can be affected by human experience. Thomas J. Ord and Trick Fuller explore this in God after deconstruction. Esther J. Hamori's book, God's Monsters, even tackles the monstrosity of God sometimes portrayed in the Bible. And that can be deeply unsettling if you're seeking a purely benevolent picture, prompting a need to reconcile these conflicting images.
So it's clear it's not just internal theological wrestling matches, right? These external cultural shifts seem to be profoundly impacting individual faith journeys, too. It feels like this societal earthquake almost, reshaping the landscape of belief, pushing people to confront how their faith tradition interacts, or maybe clashes with the wider world.
Absolutely. The cultural environment, the milieu, plays an enormous role. Mark Hackett, for instance, he really highlights that us versus them mentality often found in American evangelical culture. He describes it sometimes as a socially conservative subculture built around rigid hierarchy, even consumerism. He argues it frequently prioritizes things like political idolatry and nationalism, which can corrupt the gospel's message of hope with fear. Then you have the persistent, difficult questions around patriarchy and gender bias within the church. These are issues Angela J. Harrington's book lists cover extensively, and Christianity Today documents them too, challenging traditional roles and leadership structures that many find problematic.
And sexuality is a huge one too, isn't it?
A massive one. The church's historical and sometimes ongoing stance on human sexuality, particularly regarding 2S LGBTQIA+ individuals, that's two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and others, and the ostracism many face. Well, it's often a deeply traumatic experience. And sadly, it leads many to deconstruct their faith, as noted by Harrington and Robert D. Cornwall. It becomes a breaking point. Questions of racial justice and anti-racism are also critical catalysts now. Miranda Turner, writing for Patheos, talks about the widespread problem of biblical illiteracy and the condemnation we often unleash. This leads to really tough questions about white supremacy baked in the Christian context, a theme Angela Harrington and Christian Century also explore. Peter Choi, writing in Christian Century, identifies another crucial shift happening, a move from certainty to mystery. People are realizing that biblical faith and interpretation are not so clear-cut, especially when you try to apply them to complex modern social issues. The danger, he points out, though, is just swapping old certainties for new ones, rather than cultivating genuine intellectual humility. This also involves, Choi says, a move from superiority to mutuality, a growing skepticism of spiritual superiority, where you don't feel the need to make everyone else believe exactly like you do, but instead recognize the value in diverse perspectives and experiences.
It feels less like isolated incidents and more like a wave.
It really does. And the current trends in research definitely underscore how widespread this is. While the prompt mentioned that figure of 1 in 3 young adults deconstructing, what's maybe surprising is a statistic from Ian Harber's book, Walking Through Deconstruction. It suggests the average age of someone deconstructing is actually 54.
54.
Yeah.
Really? Not just young adults.
Right. As highlighted by Bob on Books and Christianity Today, this challenges that common assumption that it's solely a youth phenomenon. It suggests it's often, maybe more often, a white Gen X woman grappling with disillusionment later in life. And Brian D. McLaren, in his book Faith After Doubt, gives a staggering statistic. 65 million adults in the U.S. have dropped out of active church attendance, with another 2.7 million leaving every year.
Wow, those numbers are huge.
They are. And social media, X, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, it dramatically amplifies all these discussions. What might have been a trickle of resources or personal stories before is now a flood, which can be good, but it also risks creating those deconstruction echo chambers, as Childers and Barnett and Words of Grace and Hope observe, where maybe dissenting views or paths toward reconstruction get drowned out. Plus, you see public figures talking about it openly now. People like Jen Hatmaker or even Red and Link from Good Mythical Morning engaging in these very public deconstruction conversations. That makes it much more visible, more accessible, more part of the mainstream conversation.
Okay, so it's undeniable that these deep personal hurts, these big intellectual challenges, and these broad cultural shifts are all converging, creating this perfect storm for questioning. It makes you wonder, though, what does Scripture itself have to say about this kind of questioning? Is it always seen as negative?
That's where it gets really interesting, actually, connecting these trends back to the spiritual implications, the biblical perspective. Mark Hackett brings up 1 Thessalonians 5.21, but test everything. Hold fast to what is good. Now, that's not a warning against questioning. It's actually an explicit invitation to examine, to discern. It's a call to not just blindly accept, but to engage critically. It suggests intellectual honesty within faith. Hackett also points to Jesus' own approach to doubt, which was profoundly compassionate. Think about the story of Thomas in John chapter 20. Jesus doesn't scold him. He greets Thomas with peace. He encourages physical closeness, invites him to touch his wounds. He's kind, loving, understanding. He doesn't dehumanize or punish Thomas for his doubt.
Right, the doubting Thomas story often gets framed negatively, but Jesus' response was pure grace.
Exactly. That biblical model offers such a powerful counter-narrative to the hostility that, sadly, many people experience from their faith communities when they start asking hard questions. It suggests that questioning, when it comes from a genuine search for truth, can actually be met with grace, with an invitation to deeper understanding, not rejection.
So thinking about all this, what does it mean for you listening right now? What's maybe one doubt you've wrestled with, perhaps quietly, maybe pushed down? Does hearing this conversation spark a new thought about it? Maybe it's a question you tucked away, afraid it might unravel everything, when perhaps, just perhaps, it's an invitation to strengthen something vital.
And here's a practical tip if you're in that space. Try to embrace curiosity. Don't feel like you have to stifle those honest questions. As the resource Words of Grace and Hope puts it so beautifully, God is wonderfully larger than our finite ability to understand him. Asking questions might not be a sign you're drifting away. It could actually indicate God at work in your heart, driving a genuine search for truth.
That's a great perspective. And building on that, maybe the second tip is to seek out safe spaces. Look for communities, or maybe even just one or two individuals who don't shame or vilify people with doubts. Find people who actually open up space for the hard conversations, for ambiguity, for growth. That kind of environment is just crucial for navigating these deep waters, isn't it? Where you can bring your whole self, questions and all, without fearing judgment. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the what and the why, what deconstruction is, why it's happening. Now, here's where we shift gears a bit. We want to explore the how. How can we, or those we care about, move towards deeper roots? How do we avoid just deconstructing down to nothing? It's really about building something stronger, something more authentic, out of the rubble, so to speak.
Precisely. And it's so vital to emphasize this. Deconstruction really should aim to lead towards reconstruction. That's a point highlighted strongly by resources like Words of Grace and Hope and the Missio Alliance. Without that rebuilding phase, deconstruction can, sadly, become a kind of tragedy. It can lead to bitterness, isolation, feeling completely untethered. So the goal isn't just demolition, it's thoughtful rebuilding. And one of the most critical strategies for this rebuilding phase is, as you hinted at earlier, creating those safe spaces and fostering genuine, authentic community. Elisa Childers and Tim Barnett offer some really practical steps for supporting loved ones who are deconstructing. And these principles are powerful for building those kinds of spaces generally. First, they say pray for them. Second, stay calm, and importantly, stay in their life. Be a safe harbor yourself, and resist that urge we often have to immediately fix them with quick answers. Third, they suggest doing triage, which means taking the time to truly understand their specific struggles, their particular hurts, their genuine questions, what's really going on for them. And finally, set healthy boundaries. Show grace, absolutely, but without compromising your own core convictions.
That balance sounds key. Grace and boundaries.
It is. Words of Grace and Hope expands on this beautifully. They urge us to actively encourage questioning, not shut it down. Provide frameworks for learning about faith, maybe through structured book studies, thoughtful discussions on biblical interpretation, rather than just demanding rote memorization of dogma. It also stresses accepting others as they are, recognizing that diversity within the body of Christ is actually a reflection of God's goodness, not a threat to unity. This is all about building what they call authentic community, a place that doesn't shame doubts, but allows for openness, honesty, vulnerability, and crucially, leaders in these communities need to model humility and vulnerability themselves, admitting they don't have all the answers. Philip Yancey puts it so well, I yearn for the church to become a nourishing culture of that grace, that kind of environment. It's foundational for any real reconstruction to happen.
It sounds like moving away from performing certainty towards embracing honesty.
Exactly. Then, beyond the community aspect, there are specific reconstruction rhythms and practices that can help individuals rebuild personally. Kathy Escobar's book, Faith Shift, for instance, offers really tangible practices for rebuilding an authentic faith. It's about moving beyond just thinking about faith to actually living it through real embodied action. Sarah Bessey's Field Notes for the Wilderness offers strategies for understanding and grounding yourself during the process. She uses that powerful wilderness image not as a place of abandonment, but as a space where you can pursue God without all the old baggage unencumbered. Marlon Vies, whom we mentioned earlier, referenced Richard Rohr's concept of the ordering process in his own journey. That really encapsulates this idea. You have to allow the old structures to be disordered, sometimes painfully, so that something new and more integrated can be reordered in their place. Tim Keller even brings up an analogy from D.M. Lloyd-Jones, The Second Touch, like the blind man Jesus healed in stages. If you feel stuck, seeing things partially, maybe blurry, the idea is to be honest with God about your incomplete understanding and keep seeking until the vision clears. It's about saying, I want the truth, whatever it costs me. It requires active engagement, specific practices that help shape a new, more robust faith, not just passively waiting for answers to appear.
That proactive element seems really important. It's not just waiting for faith to come back.
Not at all. And a significant, often overlooked, part of this active rebuilding is healing the trauma and addressing the hurt that so often precedes or fuels deconstruction in the first place. Angela J. Harrington's book lists, which are incredibly comprehensive, include titles like Spiritual Abuse Recovery, Gaslighted by God, The Diabolical Trinity. These are resources laser-focused on recovering from trauma, toxic religious culture, and church hurt. These kinds of resources, potentially combined with professional counseling, are absolutely vital for people who've experienced deep pain. As Tim Keller notes, those who've suffered direct abuse often face a much more complicated and difficult path towards renewing their faith. Reconstruction can't really begin on shaky ground. You have to address the foundations of trust and emotional well-being first, pursue healing. It's not just about changing your mind, it's very much about healing your heart.
Right, you can't build a stable house on a damaged foundation.
Exactly. And fundamentally, for many, reconstruction often involves refocusing squarely on the core message of the gospel, on Jesus' love. Childers and Barnett emphasize this. Condemn the unchristian behaviors. Yes, challenge the harmful assumptions in light of Scripture, absolutely, but always point people back to Jesus, back to the one who didn't give up on people, who loves them unconditionally. Tim Keller, drawing insights from Francis Schaeffer's own experience with deconstruction, highlights that crucial shift away from implicit legalism towards contemplating the sheer grace and the finished work of Christ for our present lives. Schaeffer discovered that true spiritual vitality doesn't come from rigidly following rules, but from a heart reordered by grace that naturally leads to growth in the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, humility, self-control, as Paul lists in Galatians. Philip Yancey talks about this too, finding mentors who don't just talk about faith, but who act out their beliefs with compassion and selfless love. He emphasizes focusing on Jesus' core teachings, like love thy neighbor as thyself, which Mark Hackett also highlighted from Matthew 22. Yancey even found meaning in the story Jonathan Livingston Seagull, seeing it as an allegory for how Jesus' essential message of love often gets obscured by layers of religiosity and dogma. Keller also gives some really wise advice here. Distinguish between primary beliefs, the absolute core tenets like the Trinity, the deity of Christ, the atonement, the resurrection, and secondary beliefs, things like the precise mechanics of creation, the age of the earth, specific end times prophecies. Making that distinction can be immensely helpful. It can prevent a total faith collapse when maybe a secondary belief gets questioned or overturned because the essential foundations remain firm while other aspects are reevaluated.
That distinction feels really practical. It allows room for questioning without feeling like the whole thing has to fall apart.
It really does. And what's fascinating here, connecting back to the intellectual side, is how critical thinking, often the very thing that sparks deconstruction, can actually become a pathway to profound spiritual growth. Christian Standard Magazine posed an interesting question. I wonder if sometimes our doubts and questions aren't the prompting of the Spirit. That suggests that maybe our intellectual engagement isn't a threat to faith, but an invitation from God to go deeper, to understand Him and ourselves more fully. The path to a deeper faith, as Peter Shoy notes again in Christian Century, increasingly seems to involve accepting mystery and cultivating humility, rather than clinging to rigid certainty. Think of the prophet Elijah. He goes from the dramatic certainty of the fire on Mount Carmel to the profound mystery of Mount Horeb, where God isn't in the wind or the earthquake or the fire, but in that still small voice. It's like a journey from seeking outward signs of power to developing an inner, more nuanced spiritual discernment.
That journey from certainty to mystery, and the idea that our questions might actually be spirit-led, wow, that's incredibly freeing, isn't it? It reframes doubt not as some kind of personal failing, but as a potential pathway. And speaking of pathways, here's where it gets really compelling. Let's hear directly from Ian Harber about his full personal path through this whole process. Ian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, my journey, it really began much like what you've been discussing, just a deep questioning of pretty much everything I thought I knew about my faith. I remember watching a friend, Jenny, who I write about, grappling with these really profound issues, and they mirrored doubts that were already sort of simmering inside me. She was asking really hard questions about the authority of the Bible, its trustworthiness, about how the church treated women, their role in ministry. She was even questioning, whether God even exists, or if this whole thing we call Christianity was maybe just a sham. And these weren't just abstract theological debates for her or for me. They felt raw, existential. They resonated really deeply. As these questions intensified for me personally, I entered what I can only really describe as 4 years of wilderness wandering. That's how Christianity Today described it. It was a time filled with immense grief, a real sense of loss for the faith I once had so simply.
And also, the painful, honestly gut-wrenching experience of facing hostility and betrayal from within my own church community when I tried to voice my doubts, when I was genuinely seeking answers. It really felt like the ground beneath me had just completely given way.
That sounds incredibly isolating.
It was. Very. However, my return, when it happened, it wasn't like flipping a switch back to, the golden plains of unqualified belief, as the article put it, or finding some kind of ironclad intellectual certainty. It was something far more profound, I think, and ultimately more resilient. What I found, what I landed in, was a settled trust in the Lord. It wasn't about suddenly having all the answers or resolving every single theological puzzle. It was more like a fundamental shift in my orientation, you could say, a kind of surrender to something larger than my own need for absolute certainty. I started to consciously surrender to the mystery, to use that phrase again. I began praying again, reading the Bible again, but differently this time. Less about finding definitive proof texts and more about just seeking connection, seeking presence. I remember offering what felt like a kind of conditional worship, like, okay, if God exists, then He deserves praise for the beauty I see in creation, for the intrinsic goodness I still encountered in the world. And this renewed connection, it came in a really fresh, surprisingly emotionally resonant way when I started attending a church in a completely different tradition with an old college friend. That experience was, it was eye-opening. It highlighted for me that sometimes finding faith anew or reconstructing it really does mean stepping outside the old structures, those structures that maybe initially caused the pain or simply couldn't hold the weight of my questions anymore. It showed me that God's grace truly extends beyond our often narrow preconceived notions of where and how we might encounter Him. And it led me to a faith that felt and still feels both more authentic and paradoxically more deeply rooted than before.
Ian, thank you. Your journey is just incredibly powerful, and I think so many listening will find echoes of their own experience in it. It really speaks to the courage it takes to lean into those really difficult questions. So thinking about Ian's story and everything we've discussed, what does this all mean for you, our listener? How has questioning, maybe even just sitting with that uncomfortable feeling, how has it perhaps strengthened your roots? Maybe it revealed what truly anchors your faith when everything else felt like it was shifting. And here's another thought. What if this whole process of examining beliefs isn't actually about destroying faith at all, but maybe about revealing idols? Things we've unconsciously put on the throne in our lives, things we've prioritized over God or over a true understanding of Jesus, things that were never meant to bear the weight of our ultimate trust in the first place. I'm sitting here thinking, maybe you're like me and you're wondering, what if my faith house just needed a new coat of paint, maybe a few structural repairs here and there, but I was convinced the whole thing needed to be bulldozed. Sometimes we overestimate the damage, right?
That's a great image, and it captures the essence perfectly. Or maybe, to continue the analogy, perhaps you've discovered through this process that what you thought was a load-bearing wall holding everything up was actually just a poorly decorated partition wall someone put up years ago. And it was actually obscuring the true foundation underneath.
Ah, okay.
And now through this deconstruction process, you actually have the opportunity to remove that partition, see the real foundation clearly, and maybe reinforce the actual structural integrity. You get to build something genuinely sturdy, truly authentic on the bedrock that was always there. And to help you on that journey, here's another practical tip. Find a mentor or find a supportive community. Actively seek out mature believers, people who are willing to walk with you, who will listen to your questions without judgment, and support your journey without feeling the need to fix you immediately. Both Words of Grace and Hope and writers like Elisa Childers and Tim Barnett really emphasize how critical these safe spaces are, places where doubts aren't shamed, but are actually seen as potential opportunities for growth.
That feels so important. And another tip that kind of flows from that. Engage with Scripture thoughtfully. Try reading the Bible, maybe not just to reinforce what you already think you believe, but read it on its own terms as best you can. Maybe try to cut loose, just for a bit, from what you've always been told it must mean. Explore it critically, sure. Push back on those problematic passages, wrestle with them, but do it while genuinely seeking the important truths, the deeper understanding. Peter Enns and Robert D. Cornwell both suggest approaches like this. It can unlock new depths, allow the text to speak in fresh, unexpected ways. Okay, as we start to bring this deep dive to a close, let's try to summarize the really powerful journey we've explored today. It seems clear that deconstruction, even though it's often challenging, often unsettling, can actually be, as Peter Choi puts it in Christian Century, a profoundly hopeful and even life-giving activity. It's not necessarily a dead end. It's more like a dynamic, evolving process, a genuine opportunity for immense spiritual growth, leading towards a deeper, more resilient faith.
That's precisely right. I think the ultimate goal, if reconstruction follows, is about strengthening your faith for life in the real, messy world. It's about moving towards a faith that is, as Tim Keller described it, more fully biblical, internally consistent, experientially authentic, and intellectually robust. Now, it's true, deconstruction without reconstruction can lead to spiritual drift, even tragedy. We have to acknowledge that. But our sources and powerful stories like Ian Harber's clearly show that many, many people are finding new depth, renewed trust, and incredible resilience through this very process. It's a journey that can move from questioning to a richer, more grounded belief.
So as you continue on your own unique journey, whether you're just starting to ask questions or maybe you're actively in that rebuilding phase, here are 5 practical tips, kind of summarizing what we've discussed, for you to carry forward. Tip number 1, embrace your questions and seek out mentors safely. Actively pursue those curiosities. Please don't be afraid to ask those hard questions that Words of Grace and Hope encourages. They're often not a sign of a failing faith, but actually a sign of a vibrant, engaged one.
And what's really fascinating here, remember, is that Jesus himself didn't condemn genuine doubt. We saw that so clearly with Thomas. He invited him closer, offered reassurance, allowed him to experience the truth directly, even physically. So find mentors who try to embody that same Christ-like compassion, people who can provide a framework for learning and wrestling with complexity rather than just shutting you down or offering simplistic, prepackaged answers.
Yeah, finding those people is key. Tip number 2, build authentic community. Really make an effort to seek out spaces where you are truly accepted for who you are right now, not just for conforming perfectly to some specific ideology or rigid set of rules. As Words of Grace and Hope and Mark Hackett emphasize, true community embraces you, doubts and all. It fosters that deep sense of belonging, even when you're wrestling with uncertainty.
Exactly. Honest, authentic community doesn't shame or vilify people who have doubts. Instead, it creates that vital space for the difficult conversations, for holding ambiguity, and for genuine personal growth. John Pavlovitz's book, A Bigger Table, is a beautiful example of this pursuit, striving for a truly inclusive, sometimes messy, yes, but profoundly beautiful spiritual community where everyone feels welcome at the table, regardless of exactly where they are on their faith journey.
I love that image of a bigger table. Okay, tip number 3. Focus on Jesus' love and the core gospel. Try to return to the undeniable essence of your faith. As Peter Enns points out in The Sin of Certainty, God seems to desire our trust and intimacy far more than our ability to check off all the correct belief boxes. It's fundamentally about relationship, right? Connection with the divine, not just intellectual agreement with doctrine.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, thinkers like the late Bishop Spong and others argue that you can be fully committed to the way of Jesus, to his teachings, his life, his example, even while questioning things like literalism. Because the core, the absolute heart of Christianity is fundamentally about God's radical, unconditional love. Philip Yancey, after his own journey away from fundamentalism, found his faith revitalized, truly set free by focusing intensely on grace and compassion, mirroring Jesus' own life and teachings rather than being tangled up in legalism. That shift in focus can be incredibly liberating, incredibly clarifying.
Absolutely. All right, tip number 4. Seek healing through available resources. If you've experienced church hurt or any kind of spiritual trauma, please recognize that healing is a vital, absolutely non-negotiable part of genuine reconstruction. You simply cannot build a strong, healthy future on an unaddressed foundation of pain. Don't try to skip that crucial step.
Consider reaching out for professional counseling, or explore some of the excellent books specifically designed for spiritual abuse recovery, like those recommended by Angela J. Harrington. It might be a longer process, especially for those who experience direct abuse, as Tim Keller reminds us, but it is absolutely essential for your long-term spiritual and emotional health. It allows you to move forward unburdened, free from the weight of past wounds.
So important. And finally, tip number 5, reconstruct actively, embracing mystery and maybe even new traditions. Don't just stop at deconstruction. Actively, intentionally rebuild. This might mean exploring different Christian traditions or denominations, like Ian Harber courageously did, or maybe engaging with spiritual practices from different streams that offer new depth and dimension to your faith, as writers like Kathy Escobar and Sarah Bessey suggest.
And remember that crucial shift we talked about, from certainty to mystery, that Christian Century highlighted. As Ian Harber discovered in his own story, sometimes surrendering to the mystery is precisely where faith is recovered and deepened. It can lead to a new, fresh, maybe more emotionally resonant understanding of God's love and presence in your life. It's about finding a kind of peace, even in the not knowing, and learning to trust the one who holds it all.
That's beautifully put. Ian, as we wrap up here, what's maybe one final thought, one piece of encouragement you'd want to offer directly to someone listening right now who might be struggling, maybe right in the thick of their own deconstruction or reconstruction journey?
Yeah, I'd say for anyone out there wrestling with their faith right now, I really want you to know that your questions, they're not a sign of weakness. So
Yeah.
often, they're actually a profound sign of life, a sign of a sincere desire for truth. So lean into that. There is a path forward, a path to a more settled, more authentic trust in the Lord, even if, maybe especially if, it looks profoundly different than you ever imagined it would. Please don't be afraid of the wilderness seasons. Sometimes that's precisely where you find God in a profoundly new, more intimate, and honestly more beautiful way than ever before.
Powerful words, Ian. Thank you so, so much for sharing your journey, your vulnerability, and your incredible insights with us today. It's been invaluable. And to you, our listener, we really want to invite you to engage with this topic further. If you feel comfortable, share your journey on social media using the hashtag #DeepDiveFaith. Connect with others who might be on a similar path. And maybe consider exploring some of the many excellent books and resources we've mentioned today. There's just a wealth of wisdom out there waiting to be discovered, ready to accompany you on your way. May your journey forward, wherever it takes you, be filled with courage, with growing clarity, and with the profound peace that comes from seeking truth with an open and honest heart. We'll be here, ready for your next deep dive.